Hello and welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called 10 Reasons to Love Billy Cobham. So this is going to be an appreciation of Billy Cobham. I'm not going to do my top 10 favourite albums. If you want to check out those, then please pop over to Sea of Tranquility, where I did a top 10 of Billy Cobham's albums. But I will be going through 10 albums by him. But more to the point, I just want to be talking about this incredible drummer. I haven't done a Billy Cobham dedicated video on this channel yet, and that's ridiculous really, because the reason I'm here is because of Billy Cobham. So let's start with a story. I started playing drums in 1980. The reason why I started playing drums was because I heard bands like Rainbow, Whitesnake, Motorhead, Iron Maiden, that whole new wave of British heavy metal, right? That music was going to take me towards progressive rock and then eventually towards jazz fusion. But within the first few weeks that I started playing the drums, my mom told me that there was some drummer on the television who was going to be doing a drum masterclass. This is one of those bizarre things that happens in your life sometimes. It's really strange. So I just started playing the drums. I'm sort of 12 years old. And on terrestrial television, they had this masterclass by Billy Cobham. Right, so I was able to sit down and watch this guy play. He was sort of working with a jazz drummer, which I think was Nick France, the British jazz drummer, and he was working with a rock drummer guy that had worked with, I can't remember his name, but he'd worked with Shakin' Stevens. And he was sort of not quite critiquing them, but they played and then they discussed taking drum solos, and then Cobham came out and did a whole ton of stuff. Of course, I didn't know who Billy Cobham was at all. Right, there was this drummer, and I remember watching him and in my mind comparing him to my heroes at that time, which would have been people like Cozy Powell, Clive Burr, Ian Pace. You know, those are the drummers I was listening to at the time, and they're fantastic drummers, but I knew that what Billy was doing was on another level. I knew that this was it, even at that age. My dad, who had been a drummer himself when he was younger, a jazz drummer, recognised the same thing. So he went and bought a Billy Cobham album. I wouldn't have bought a Billy Cobham album because I was listening to heavy metal, but he went and bought Crosswinds. And Crosswinds was an album that sat there in my dad's collection, and I would go to it every now and then and listen to it, and I was just sort of almost like dumbfounded by what was going on that album. You know, I was trying to struggle my way through Iron Maiden songs or Angel Witch or whatever it was I was listening to, trying to master those. But this was almost like slightly beyond me, right? But I knew that that's where the quality was. Eventually, as I sort of came to fusion through, well, originally through Jeff Beck, through the Wired album. But I'd be listening to Cozy Powell albums and Gary Moore albums that were pretty much fusion albums, even albums like Variations by Andrew Lloyd Webber that featured Colosseum 2. These are the albums that I was aware of, and I was really sort of zoning in on that sound. Then there's this Billy Cobham album in my dad's collection, but eventually through players like Jeff Beck and then discovering John McLaughlin and the Mavish Knockshot, that was the only time I then went to go to that Cobham album and check it out. And I can remember to this day just putting it on, and Michael Brecker's solo on The Pleasant Pheasant, just sort of listening to it and going, oh my God, this is it. This is it. You know, just knowing that I discovered something drum-wise that was going to be very important to me. But like I said, right from day one, Cobham was an influence on my drumming. He's the most important influence on me, drum-wise, I would say. I've never tried to copy his licks. It's the spirit and what he's doing, the way he plays, right? So I've pulled out 10 albums out of my collection that we're going to go through, and I'm going to see what pops into my mind as we go through each one. I haven't put Crosswinds in. I've spoken about Crosswinds so many times on this channel. I've banned it now from being featured, you know, which just gives me a bit of space as I pick up the albums, a bit of space to talk about other Cobham albums, but I've also featured some of the classic ones. So these are sort of in time order, you know, from the earliest release to the most recent. It's mainly the 70s albums I've pulled out. I've only pulled out 10. I could sit here and talk a lot longer, but I just thought I pulled out 10. So here's the first album by Billy Cobham, Spectrum. There it is. This came out in 1973. He recorded it whilst he was in the band with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, while he was still in the band. I think, you know, reading interviews with Billy Cobham, he was aware, I think, very aware musician. He was aware that the writing was on the wall with the Mahavishnu Orchestra before it finished. He records this album before the band disbands. So, and it was a really successful album. So he's almost like set out what he's going to be doing, you know, musically. Now I think it's really important with Billy Cobham. He's an incredible drummer. He really laid the foundations of what fusion drumming is going to be. I think Tony Williams had done a lot before him, but not that much before him. But in terms of actual influence, you know, his playing in the Mahavishnu Orchestra is just a standard that he sets. So his sort of machine gun style, the use of the double bass drums, the lots of toms and rolls flying around, and most importantly the way that he divides up time, the way he plays odd times and he divides those up into clusters, what I call additive time, where you're adding like clusters of rhythms together rather than the sort of more Western classical of dividing time. He's doing both of those things, but it's really remarkable, his approach. And then he then brings out this album where he's doing all that, but he's doing it in a much funkier R&B context. There's a lot more funk on here, and in a way there's more rock, because his masterstroke is to bring in the incredible Tommy Bolin, and Tommy Bolin's a guitarist that is jazz influenced, but he's coming from the rock world. But also the thing that never gets mentioned so much is on here, there's other tracks where he uses a lot more horns and brass. Before the Mahavishnu, he was in a band called Dreams, which featured the Brecker brothers. And Dreams were really pioneering a sound, along with like Chicago, Blood, Sweat and Tears, and people like Don Ellis, which is a sort of much more brass, big band orientated approach to jazz fusion. I really feel I want to do a video on this at some point, but I think Cobham's really important in that as well. And you could hear it on the other tracks on here, where he's got a slightly more expanded band. It's not the same lineup as you would expect to get on a Mahavishnu Orchestra album. It's not guitar, bass and drums, violin, but we've got like Joe Farrell on flute and soprano saxophone, Jimmy Owens on flugelhorn and trumpet, you know, just expanding the lineup of John Troppier on guitar, Jan Hammer on keyboards and Ron Carter on bass and Ray Barretto on congas. The congas are very important. There's a Latin American influence to Cobham. So coming out of the Mahavishnu, which was like so important for fusion, Cobham comes out and lays the groundwork for something really important in here with that expanded brass sound, right? The much funkier R&B thing and this Latin American thing, plus everything he's done in the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Of course, the follow-up to this is Crosswinds, which I've talked about extensively, but on that album, he seems to extend that out. It's even more funkier, even more Latin American influenced, and even more brass dominated. You know, this is big band jazz fusion. It's really interesting what they're doing. Right, so he follows that up with this album. This is another fusion masterpiece. This is why it's so important to do these videos, to get into the nooks and crannies and discuss these albums. This is like everything I've just said, but adding a modern classical influence in. The composition here is much more intense. There's certain moments where this does sound like modern classical music. There's other points where it sounds just like the full-on funk, and other it's just ripping fusion. This is where I think Cobham brings in the prog influence. The classic era jazz fusion in the 70s, that's what we're hearing, is this progressive rock influence coming in and affecting these albums. And these albums for me are the prog albums. You know, when I was a progressive rock fan, listening to Yes and Genesis, and then I suddenly discovered an album like this was like, oh my god, this is the real deal. You know, this is virtuoso musicians that really have that sort of classical technique and the jazz improvisation chops, making, you know, through composed compositions. This is a really incredible album. So I've talked about these albums before on this channel. Let's get into some of the other albums from the 70s, which I haven't spoken to as much. So here we have, right, from 1975, Shabazz. Okay, this is if you think of Billy Cobham as bringing out Spectrum, the Tommy Bolin band, and then we get, to me, these 3 albums by what I call the Michael Brecker band, right? So that is John Abercrombie on guitar, Michael Brecker on saxophone, Randy Brecker on trumpet, Glenn Ferris on trombone. On this one we got Milky Liv Eviev on keyboards. On crosswinds we've got George Duke, we've got Alex Blake on bass, and we've got John Williams on crosswinds. But it's a similar lineup and a similar sound. Now this album here is really interesting to me because that sound that he's pioneered on Total Eclipse and Crosswinds, live, they are taking that out in the same way the Mavish Orchestra did. There's many fusion bands. If you think of Weather Report, they improvise and they extemporise. But if they're playing Birdland, you're going to hear Birdland. But when you listen to the Mavish Orchestra, a track that's on the album that is, say, maybe 5 minutes long, can extend to 30 minutes. And they can go off and sort of take it away. I know Weather Report do this, but they don't do it, to me, in the same way that the Mavish Orchestra did. Mavish Orchestra took it out, really coming almost from, I think, Coltrane and Hendrix. It's those 2 approaches. Cobham does that on here. He really takes that sound out. This is full on jazz. It's jazz fusion, but it's jazz. He's really extemporizing. It's something that disappeared from the jazz fusion movement later on. This is quite an incredible album. All right. His sound at this point, where everyone else is going towards a more commercial and funky sound, as he gets to the mid-70s, and you've had Headhunters, and you've had Weather Report with Birdland, and they've had big success with a more accessible sound. Cobham goes heavier. This is the point where he goes heavier. And one of the heaviest albums ever made was Life and Times. This is a real burning album. The lineup has changed here. We've lost the Brecker brothers, but we've gained John Schofield, a very young John Schofield on guitar, that is just burning on this album. Dwalili Gonga, of course, that's George Duke on keyboards. He's back. The incredible Doug Rausch on bass. Right, let's just talk a little bit about Doug Rausch. Doug Rausch crops up on so many 70s fusion albums. He's one of the great 70s fusion bass players for me. He's a real pioneer. He worked with Santana, he worked with Lenny White, he worked with Billy Cobham. And he really pioneered the double thumb approach, which allowed him to play very, very fast. The approach that Victor Wooten went on to utilise so successfully. But Doug Rausch is doing something on bass which is really interesting, really unique. Very sadly, I think in 1979 he died of, a drugs-related death, which I think has taken him off the list of great bass players. So we have Stanley Clarke and we have Jaco Pastorius, but I really feel Doug Rausch should be on there, and you can hear him on this album really tearing up. This is a heavy album. Okay. Now here we come to another one of my favourite Billy Cobham albums, and I think it's an underrated album. I think if you know all the albums I've covered so far, and you may well, this is the one you need to go and check out next, because it's really got its own sound and its own individual approach to jazz fusion, and that's Magic. This album here. This album has a sort of very quirky European sound. It's unlike any other album I can think of. It's got some of Cobham's best drumming on as well. He's really playing on here. Now, if I just pull out the liner notes and give you a quick go through the lineup. So it's Joachim Kuhn on electric piano, incredible player. And then you got Mark Toskin also on keyboards. I think that having the 2 keyboards there is making it a lot more ornate. The incredible Pete Maunau on guitar, who's another unsung jazz fusion guitarist from the 70s, and then Randy Jackson on bass. But at certain points in time, we get Alvin Batiste on clarinet. Now, of course, clarinet's a really important instrument for jazz. In the 30s, it was one of the most important instruments going, with Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw. I'm sure Cobham's aware of that, because the Benny Goodman quartet with Gene Krupa, was it Teddy Wilson and Lionel Hampton, was very influenced on drummers. They're almost like the sort of return to Forever and Mahavishnu of their day, that group. Very virtuoso. And I think he's trying to bring that sound back. This is also interesting because it's got both Pete Escovedo and Sheila Escovedo, which is of course Sheila E. But this album's got a very quirky sound to it. It also is where he introduces vocals. Bizarrely, on a track called Puffins Stuff, which has got Alvin Batiste, the clarinet players, on vocals on that. Puffins Stuff's probably the most bizarre tune ever written by Billy Cobham. It's a sort of warning against the uses of marijuana, the downside of marijuana. He sort of warns us all about the dangers of that, and then goes off into some of the most heaviest, brutal jazz fusion, which I'm sure anybody that was blitzed out on their brain listening to it back in the 70s appreciated very much. I always thought it's quite ironic that he would choose to do that in the middle of a song against that use. But anyway, that's the way Billy is. He is a clean living, very fit man, you know, which is why he can play the drums the way he does. Here we have a live mother for you. Now this one is basically the sort of live version of Magic. It also features some tunes by Steve Kahn and Tom Scott, who were guests on it. The lineup on here is Mark Soskin again on piano, and then Billy Cobb and Steve Cobb, Tom Scott. Right, who's on bass on here? It could be. Of course, it's Alfonso Johnson, isn't it? This is a really great live album. He also did the live album with George Duke at this time, and did some the live on tour. I'm not so keen on that album. I felt that was a little bit lightweight. It's still great, but this one is the better album from that period. You know, it's got some great stuff, and it's got versions of On a Magic Carpet, Right, and Terry's the Star off Magic, which are great to hear because I love those tunes. All right, but here Cobham starts to move towards a much more commercial sound in the 70s. All right, starting with this album, Simplicity of Expression, which is, I think this is the one that features Kamal on vocals. Let's just double check. Yeah, Kamal on vocals, and then the lineup is basically Peter Mano again on guitar, who I absolutely love. I can't tell you how much I love his guitar playing. Randy Jackson on bass, Joachim Kuhn on keyboards, Mike Maneri on vibraphone, and we've got Alvin Batiste. So very similar lineup to Magic, but this has got some incredible sort of funky Latin American songs, and I absolutely love them. I've been critical of the sort of more commercial Fusac of the late 70s. You know, when people like, you know, perhaps Stanley Clarke, Herbie Hancock, and a few others start to go through the commercial, they start to bring the vocals in, and I'm never so sure about that. This album is as accessible and cheesy as it gets, but I absolutely love it because Cobham just burns, and they take solos and they burn, and the tunes actually, Cobham's great with a riff. He's one of the great riff masters, you know. Jimmy Page is one of the great riff masters, you know. Tony Iommi is. Joe Zawinul is. Think of Birdland. But so's Cobham. You know, you think of Stratus or Pleasant Pheasant, you know. So that's a great album. Right. The next album I want to talk about, I haven't got, and I've never been able to get a copy of it, and it's the album BC. I have a lot of those tracks on this, Best of Billy Cobham. I had this as a kid, and there's tracks like What Is Your Fantasy? Those tracks are off the album BC. Go and check it out. It's really hard to get on vinyl, get a copy of, but it's Billy Cobham in full-on disco phase, and he's absolutely burning. So I really suggest you go and check out this album. I'm just going to whiz through two more albums from the early 80s. I think this band, and here we've got Billy Cobham's Glass Menagerie, and then Billy Cobham's Glass Menagerie Live Smoking. This is a really great band. And it's got Dean Parks on guitar. There's some beautiful compositions on here, which are then really taken out and they're really burning on this album. This is a fantastic album here. And there's a brilliant version of Red Baron. The version of Red Baron on here is I like more than the version on Spectrum because they burn. After that, Cobham in the 80s starts to succumb to 80s-itis, and he never really does anything after that which really reaches the heights of these 70s albums. But for me, these 70s albums are amongst the great jazz fusion albums, so they must get included on this channel. I cannot tell you how important Billy Cobham is. He's the first fusion drummer I listened to, one of the first drummers I listened to, full stop. I learned so much from him. My basic idea of what a great drummer was is based upon Billy Cobham. So then when I heard people like Terry Bozzio and Simon Phillips, anybody playing the double bass with all the toms and playing in that way, that was the gold standard for me, and those are the drummers I followed. So influential. I'm going to return to him on another video, I think, because I've actually crossed Billy's path a number of times. I haven't spoken about this, but I might save that for another video, I think, because I think I have said enough for now. So that's my appreciation of Billy Cobham. 10 reasons why you should love him, and believe me, these aren't the only 10. There's so many. Right, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and if you love what I'm doing, go and check my Patreon out, because there's so much more content on there that you will love. So my patrons have actually said to me, make sure you tell them all about the Patreon. So I am. So it's them telling me to tell you. So you've got to go and check it out. So it's in the link below, and anyway, I'll see you on the next video. Thank you very much.